following program is intended for mature audiences.
Welcome to Rudy's Revelation. Finding revelation in the news and meaning in media. It's November 16th, 2020. Today I won't be talking back to the Sunday Talking Heads on CBS Face the Nation. It was preempted by the Masters, and I couldn't bear listening to Chuck Todd nor Chris Wallace. But I will be checking in on Sunday Morning Propaganda at our favorite feel-good feature news program, CBS Sunday Morning, where CBS News' journalist Gayle King fawns over former President Barack Hussein Obama, who is on a book tour looking to prop up his legacy, which in contrast to the Trump presidency appears as a failure. We'll also be tearing into the Sunday New York Times, showing how the newspaper continually mischaracterizes the facts to mislead the public. And of course, I'll be going over the weekend headlines, all in the next 30 minutes or so. But first, I'll be taking you back to school, giving you some historical context to frame this week's news narratives. The word of the day is coup d'etat.
A sudden decisive exercise of force in politics, especially the violent overthrow or alteration of an existing government by a small group.
Because everybody's been talking about coup, and a coup d'etat is different than a coup. A coup is a brilliant, sudden, and unusually highly successful stroke or act, and a coup de grace is a death blow or death shot administered to end the suffering of one mortally wounded, or a decisive finishing blow, act, or even event. The reason I bring up coup is because I wanted to talk a little bit about the Kennedy assassination.
I submit to you that what took place on November 22nd, 1963, was a coup d'etat. Its most direct, tragic result was the reversal of President Kennedy's commitment to withdraw from Vietnam. The war is the biggest business in America, worth $80 billion a year. President Kennedy was murdered by a conspiracy that was planned in advance at the highest levels of our government, and it was carried out by fanatical and disciplined Cold Warriors in the Pentagon and CIA's covert operation apparatus, among them Clay Shaw here before you. It was a public execution.
So there you have it from Kevin Costner in Oliver Stone's movie JFK. And he spelled it out better than anybody could. It was, in fact, a coup d'etat. It wasn't a lone gunman, as others have suggested, but it was a conspiracy to murder the President of the United States, leveled by the deep state, who obviously didn't like the way JFK was handling things. And then, ceremoniously, his brother was killed also. Later date. The assassination of John F. Kennedy, mortal shooting of John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, as he rode in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. His accused killer was Lee Harvey Oswald, a former U.S. Marine who had embraced Marxism and defected for a time in the Soviet Union. Oswald never stood trial for murder because while being transferred after having been taken into custody, he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a distraught Dallas nightclub owner. Now, those of us who have studied the assassination of the president, The Last Confession of E. Howard Hunt, the ultimate keeper of secrets regarding who killed JFK, and this is from Rolling Stone, who Hunt apparently gave a deathbed confession. Once, when the old spy master thought he was dying, his eldest son came to visit him at his home in Miami. The scourges recently had been the constraint of terrible lupus, pneumonia, cancers of the jaw and prostate, gangrene, the amputation of his left leg. It was like something was eating him up. Long past were his years of heroic service to the country. In the CIA, he had helped mastermind a violent removal of a duly elected leftist president in Guatemala and assisted in subterfuges that led to the murder of Che Guevara. But no longer could you see him in the suave, pipe-smoking, cocktail party-loving, clandestine operative whose Cold War exploits he himself had almost obsessively turned into novels, one of which, East of Farewell, the New York Times once called the best sea story of World War II. So this expose goes on to say St. John Hunt, the son of Howard Hunt, E. Howard Hunt, received a deathbed confession from him admitting that he helped mastermind the murder of John F. Kennedy. This is from Heavy. E. Howard Hunt's JFK assassination confession, 5 facts you need to know. Now, this is from Heavy, so in a detailed confession, which he gave shortly before he died, putting the assassination at the feet of a shadowy figures in the CIA and claiming that the trail led directly to the White House itself, debunking the government's supposed lone gunman theory. Hunt's confession is getting renewed attention now that the President Donald Trump authorized the release of thousands of government documents associated with the assassination. Trump is still reviewing some documents at the request of spy agencies that want their release blocked. So we'll go over the 5 points here. Hunt told his son that LBJ was ultimately behind the assassination of JFK. And of course, it refers to the Rolling Stone article I was just reading from, the last confession of E. Howard Hunt. St. John claims his father later sketched out a fuller narrative. Howard Hunt was a White House plumber who organized the Watergate break-in. 4, Nixon was captured on tape saying that Hunt involved a scab that could uncover a lot of things. And so we're going to go to LouRockwell.com, where he interviews Matthias Brockers. And Matthias Brockers is a German investigative journalist and author of more than 10 books, most of them related to the topic of drugs, terrorism, and deep politics. He works for the daily German newspaper Taz and webzine Telepolis. His latest book, JFK, Coup d'etat in America, was published this August. And this is an article from 2013. So I'm just going to concentrate on what Matthias says here. In January 1967, shortly after Jim Garrison in New Orleans had started his prosecution of the CIA backgrounds of murder, and that was from the clip of JFK. If people didn't know, Oliver Stone's JFK movie was about Jim Garrison, a New Orleans district attorney who decided to try others for the murder of President John F. Kennedy. So Matthias goes on, in January 1967, shortly after Jim Garrison in New Orleans had started his prosecution of the CIA backgrounds of the murder, the CIA published a memo to all its stations suggesting the use of the term conspiracy theorists for everyone criticizing the Warren Report findings. Now, the Warren Report was the government assessment surrounding the events and the murder of the president, John F. Kennedy. Until then, the press and the public mostly used the term assassination theories when it come to the alternative views of the lone nut Lee Harvey Oswald. But with this memo, this change in very good conspiracy theories became what is, until today, a term to smear, denounce, and defame anyone who dares to speak about any crime committed by the state, military, or intelligence services. Before Edward Snowden, anyone claiming a kind of total surveillance of internet and phone traffic would have been named a conspiracy nut. Today, everyone knows better.
Less than 3% of you people read books.
Now we're going to go off to the book club, JFK and American Coup d'etat, The Truth Behind the Kennedy Assassination. Now this is another JFK coup d'etat book by John Hughes Wilson. The description says, in 1963, the idea that the President of the United States could be gunned down in broad daylight was almost unbelievable. Like a lot of other crimes launched by the state. In America, men and women wept openly in the streets for their dead leader, but events soon began to unpick the original version of what happened. It turned out that the official report was little more than a crude government whitewash designed to hide the real truth. Even American presidents admitted it as such. President Nixon memorably confessed in a private that the Warren Report was the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on the American public. Well, until now. Or until 9/11. It began to emerge that maybe Lee Harvey Oswald, the original one-nut gunman, may not have acted on his own. Others were involved too. That meant no lone gunman, but a conspiracy. This book attempts to answer the big question, who really shot JFK? So there are many books like this. I recommend this one, JFK by An American Coup d'etat by John Hughes Wilson. I'm going to go right off to the news. I'm going to lead with this story from the Epoch Times. Trump lawyer Sidney Powell were getting ready to overturn election results in multiple states. Well, that's really in direct contradiction of all that we're hearing on the mainstream news. Former federal, this is an article by Jack Phillips. Former federal prosecutor Sidney Powell, a Trump campaign lawyer, suggested in a Sunday interview that the president's legal team is receiving a deluge of evidence concerning voter fraud and irregularities. She says, we're getting ready to overturn election results in multiple states, Powell said on Fox Business, adding that she has enough evidence of election fraud to launch a widespread criminal investigation. I don't want to make comments without having the evidence to back it up. Apparently, the DOJ is also conducting an investigation. Powell claims that election software switched millions of votes from President Donald Trump to Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. Powell is notably the counsel to the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, engineering a stunning comeback with the Department of Justice moving to drop the charges. From Fox News, Pompeo says U.S. critics at Human Rights Council have the most to hide. The U.S. was criticized by countries such as North Korea and Iran, as well as China. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Tuesday brushed off criticism of human rights records by countries such as China and Iran, arguing that countries who abuse human rights most often shout the loudest. And he says brutal regimes shouting the loudest about our record have the most to hide about their abysmal records. It comes after the U.S. faced a periodic review of the controversial Human Rights Council on Monday, in which countries like Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and China took shots at the U.S. at the forum. China, whose communist government has persecuted minorities in the Xinjiang province, and that's the Uyghurs, and freedoms in Hong Kong, accused the U.S. of systematic racism, proliferation of guns, and military interventions abroad. Accused the U.S. of systemic racism. Well, now we know where that came from. And I just wanted to point out a couple articles from earlier in the year when China was appointed to the influential UN Rights Council panel. Given China's own rights record, the appointment has sparked concern about the future of the UN human rights agenda. Well, the Human Rights Council has always been criticized for nodding to authoritarian regimes. Last week, China was appointed to a seat on the Consultative Group of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Zhang Duan, an official of the Chinese mission in Geneva, was nominated and confirmed by the Asia Regional Grouping and will hold the seat until March 2021. The appointees places China on the influential panel that oversees candidate recommendations for UN human rights experts and is likely to raise some concerns given China's less than perfect record on human rights issues. Just to clear that up. And from the Independent Sentinel, China reviews human rights abuses from the Human Rights Council. And then they go, seriously? The next story is bizarre. American leftists, including the family of young black women killed by police as she stepped in the line of fire, begged the UN Human Rights Council to investigate the United States for human rights abuses and systemic racism. China was recently elected to the UN Human Rights Council. The council reviewed the U.S. human rights record. China wishes to recommend that the U.S. that they root out systemic racism, address widespread police brutality, and combat discrimination against African Americans. Folks, the Han Chinese, which are the ruling tribe in China, are the most racist. They're racist against other ethnic groups in China. I mean, just look at the Uyghurs. And again, this is from New York Post. U.S. human rights ripped by Russia, China, and North Korea during UN panel. This is from The Spectator. Did the U.S. raid European software company Skytel and seize their servers in Germany? Our intel source says yes, it happened. This is a one-source story. But if anybody's following it, the one source happens to be Texas Congressman Louis Gohmert, who told Newsmax that people on the ground in Germany report that Skytel, which hosted elections data improperly through Spain, was raided by a large U.S. Army force and their servers were seized in Frankfurt. Skytel is a Barcelona-based company that provides electronic voting systems worldwide, many of which have proven vulnerable to electronic manipulation. Skytel has or had Soros and Democratic Party connections. Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's Vulcan Capital has invested $40 million in Skytel. So that's a one-source story, but it is Congressman Louis Gohmert is the source. And here from Great Game India, they basically say the same thing. U.S. military raided Skytel servers in Germany for evidence after vote-switching scandal. Going on to PJ Media, exclusive, Target restores transgender craze book after PJ Media inquiry. On Friday, Target confirmed to PJ Media that it restored Abigail Schreier's important book, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze That's Seducing Our Daughters, following backlash after Target removed the book from its inventory. The company appeared to have removed the book after one solitary Twitter user complained. PJ Media has sent a press inquiry on Friday morning asking Target to account for its actions. Instead, the company reversed its course. From the Washington Post, Minneapolis violence surges as police officers leave department in droves. Now everybody knows what's going on in Minneapolis. They moved to defund the police, and there was a giant rise in violent crime, and now they're looking to rehire police officers. From Zero Hedge, Las Vegas columnists ran a test and county officials accepted fake signatures on 8 different ballots. From The Atlantic, from Ezekiel Emanuel, who is supposed to have some cabinet position awarded to him if Biden indeed takes office. So he writes in The Atlantic, "Why I hope to die at 75, an argument that society and families and you will be better off if nature takes its course swiftly and promptly." 75, that's how long I want to live. You sure it's not 30 and you can go off to Carousel like the Logan's Run? This preference drives my daughters crazy. It drives my brothers crazy. I'm loving friends thinking I'm crazy. They think I can't mean what I say, that I haven't thought clearly about this because there is so much in the world to see and do. To convince me of my errors, they enumerate the myriad of people I know who are over 75 and doing quite well. They are certain that I get closer to 75, I will push the desired age back to 80, then 85, and even 90. But I'm sure of my position. Living too long is also a loss. It renders many of us, if not disabled, then faltering and declining, a state that may not be worse than death, but is nonetheless deprived. I'm not going to take any advice from Ezekiel Emanuel, that's for sure. This is just more anti-human eugenics. From Associated Press, China congratulates Joe Biden on being elected U.S. president, says we respect the choice of the American people. Of course they do. From the Wall Street Journal, Chicago schools reopening online only as coronavirus cases rise. Nation's third largest district had planned a mix of online and in-person classes. Chicago officials said Wednesday that they would begin the school year with online-only classes amid rising cases of coronavirus in the city, narrowing the number of top districts still considering in-person classes. Again, from the Wall Street Journal, where Joe Biden stands on key issues. All you need to know is the subhead here. The president-elect, as he's being called, has promised to undo large parts of Trump's policies in areas from healthcare to immigration. Well, we know where he stands on immigration. So, this is an article by the Wall Street Journal staff. President-elect Joe Biden promised on the 2020 campaign trail to undo large parts of the President Trump's policies in areas from healthcare to immigration. He also promised the federal government would play a greater role in combating the coronavirus pandemic. Well, he's talking about lockdown. So, again from the Wall Street Journal, Elon Musk says he tested positive for COVID-19. Long skeptical about virus severity, the CEO raises new questions about testing. This is an article by Robert Wall and Heather Somerville. Chief Executive Elon Musk, who has repeatedly played down the risk of the coronavirus since early in the pandemic, says he tested positive for COVID-19 and sought to raise doubts about the validity of such testing more broadly. Mr. Musk on Twitter said on Twitter, a Thursday night saliva sample came back positive for the virus. He took a PCR, or polymerase chain reaction test, after early rapid test response tests had returned both positive and negative results. The rapid response test isn't considered as accurate as the PCR test that typically involves a nasal or throat swab. Well, even Dr. Birx and everybody early in this pandemic said the testing is not accurate and that it gives many false positives. From Reuters, this is from the 13th, U.S. Justice Alito says pandemic has led to unimaginable curbs on liberty. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito said that the COVID-19 pandemic has led to previously unimaginable curbs on individual liberty, singling out restrictions on religious events. We have never before seen restrictions as severe, extensive, and prolonged as those experienced for most of 2020. From Bloomberg News, Lagarde says her hunch is that ECB will adopt digital currency. The European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde signaled that her institution would create a digital currency within years in what would be a dramatic change to the Eurozone's financial sector. From Mediaite, Trump posts bonkers video from John Voight declaring civil war between righteousness and Satan. President Donald Trump is continuing to insist that he'll win the election in the end with legal votes amid a number of his legal team's cases being rejected by judges. And on Wednesday night, he retweeted a very bizarre video from John Voight, backing him up on that. In the video that was flagged by Twitter for election misinformation, Voight declared that it is a lie that Joe Biden won the presidency. We all know the truth. As if we all don't know the truth, he said. And when one tries to deceive, we know that one can't get away with it. There will be a price to pay. The ones who are jumping for joy now are jumping towards the horror that they will be in for, because I know that the promises being made from the left to the American people will never come to be. From the Washington Times, exclusive, China's secretive crash, nuclear buildup revealed. This is a story by Bill Gertz. China is rapidly building up its nuclear forces, including the expansion of plutonium and uranium plants as part of a secretive crash program to add warheads to its growing missile and bomber forces, according to declassified U.S. briefing slides obtained by the Washington Times. 4 slides were part of a recent briefing for the NATO allies in the past month on Chinese nuclear forces and show 3 facilities that appear to have sharply increased in size since 2010. From the New York Times, election results tracking viral disinformation. President-elect, as he's being called, Joseph R. Biden Jr., has won the presidential election, according to the New York Times, but there are efforts to sow doubt about the income. November 13th, a scheme to hand Trump electors in state legislatures is highly unlikely to happen. Here's how often election fraud has come up on right-wing radio talk shows. Beware of the misinformation from Stop the Steal rallies this weekend. One American News spreads debunked election claims. So the New York Times goes off and trying to fight the information war against people on the right who are just trying to get to the bottom of the truth. Tearing into the New York Times, behind Trump's year-long effort to turn losing into winning. Even before he was elected in 2016, Donald Trump was building a conspiracy theory about voter fraud that took on new energy this year, and his political fortunes ebbed during the coronavirus pandemic. The trouble broke out inside the main counting room in Detroit late on the morning of November 4th. It was the day after the election, and until then, the process of tabulating votes from the city's various counting boards had gone smoothly inside the TCF Center, the cavernous convention hall that plays host to the North American International Auto Show. As batches of ballots came in by van, workers methodically inspected and registered them at 134 separate tables, each monitored by voting rights observers and so-called election challengers from each party. But the posture of the Republican challengers shifted as the count swung in favor of Joe Biden, and the word spread that President Trump would sue. One witness, a nonpartisan observer, Julie Maroney, heard a Republican organizer saying, "Now we're going to challenge every ballot." As GOP playbook on voter fraud falls flat, some ask what's next. In dozens of lawsuits, Republicans tried to make voting and counting votes harder. After a record turnout in a Democratic presidential win, according to the New York Times, some wonder if that's the party's best strategy. It was an election where Republican charges of fictitious voter fraud took center stage before, during and after the count, backed by a barrage of lawsuits intent of making it harder to cast or tally votes. Yet by its end, Americans had cast ballots at a rate not seen in a century. A Democrat was elected president, and Republicans drew surprising support from Black and Latino voters, the very groups the party historically targeted with restrictive voting laws in state after state. That strategy Republicans long relied on largely fell flat, experts say, can be explained by partisan divisions that drove record turnout, by self-included wounds on the part of the President Trump, and by a pandemic that turned a gradual trend toward voting early by mail or in person into a stampede. So they're trying to justify the number of votes. And anybody who understands how the fraud works is they started announcing how it would go even before Election Day. And then it went that way. Because, of course, they're going to delay the voting, delay the count, and so they could match the number of winning votes cast for their opponent, in this case, Donald Trump. Biden asks Republicans to give him a chance, but they're not interested. Joe Biden promised not only to win, but to restore the soul of the nation. But the deep divisions that animated President Trump's tenure shows no signs of receding. And this is an article by Asted Herndon. The change at the Sunday prayer service was so subtle, it even went unnoticed by several congregants. Tucked in between calls for the divine health and wisdom, the Reverend Fred Krebs of St. Paul Lutheran Church, who rarely brings up politics, fleetingly mentioned this month's presidential election. We pray for a peaceful transition, he told the congregants. My Democratic friends think Joe Biden is really going to heal everything and unify everyone, said Jeannie Smith, who attends a more conservative Spring Street Gospel Church in Mason. They are deceived. Now you want healing, she added. Now you want to come together? You have not earned it, she says. That is hard reality Mr. Biden is facing even after winning the race, again according to the New York Times, which has secured a larger share of the popular vote than any challenger since 1932. Suspect. Towering before him is a wall of Republican resistance, starting with Mr. Trump's refusal to concede, extending to GOP lawmakers' reluctance to acknowledge his victory, and stretching perhaps most significantly for American politics in the long term to ordinary voters who steadfastly deny the election's outcome, like most do. Because as Trump said before, they cheat, there is voter fraud. To say there isn't is just being disingenuous. See, I tried to find this in the online article. I couldn't. Even in defeat, Trump found new supporters across the country. Liberal New Yorkers threw money at doomed candidates all over the U.S. Donations went to glamorous but unwinnable Senate races. Meanwhile, a representative in Brooklyn may lose to a first-time candidate and QAnon supporter. So, article by Genia Belafonte. On Saturday afternoon, as the champagne virtually uncorked itself in New York City in celebration of what looked like the end of Trumpism, an alternate history was unfolding in the southern stretches of Brooklyn. A Republican named Mark Susowitz was leading in a race against an incumbent for a state assembly seat in and around Coney Island that had been held by a Democrat for decades. Mr. Susowitz was a real estate agent whose support extended incongruously to tax credits for organic farmers and mandatory life skills training in public schools. Presented with a contest between an incumbent holding 4 graduate degrees, including a doctorate from Columbia. Oh, well, that's... Well, if somebody has a doctorate from Columbia, why should we even put up a candidate? They should just be anointed. And a candidate sympathetic to a fantasy alleging world domination by a chain of Satanist pedophiles extending from Georgetown to Santa Monica, you would think that New Yorkers beyond the district might have opened their checkbooks in the name of a proven competence and clarity. See, that's what they do. They always, they sit there with their college pedigrees and act like people can't tell the difference between truth and lies. You don't need to go to school to understand the difference between a truth and a lie, or when people are lying. This is from the real estate section of the New York Times. Robots join the sales team. Brokers can hand off tours of listings and a litany of client questions to their bionic colleagues, but a human has to step in when a deal is ready to be made, because you don't want to give up that commission to a robot. Zenny is not your ordinary real estate broker. For starters, Zenny is only 3 feet tall with a long, slender body and a rectangular head. Zenny is also quite young. Created in 2017 by ZenPlace, a rental management startup, Zenny is a remote-controlled robot that is essentially an iPad mounted on a wheelbase and is part of an expanding fleet of bionic agents showing homes across the United States. During COVID-19, their numbers are only growing. So the robot revolution is coming. The pandemic is showing us how capitalism is amazing and inadequate, why big business needs big government and vice versa. And as always, we end up in the New York Times op-ed section, the Sunday Review, the best and worst of opinion and editorial. And again, it's full of Trump bashing. Here's something on climate change, the post-presidency of a con man, au revoir but not adieu. But the one I found here is Nixon has some advice. And basically this is from Nixon's book. And I'm quoting here. If I were to demand a recount, the organization of the new administration and the orderly transfer of responsibility from the old to the new might be delayed for months. The situation within the entire federal government would be chaotic. Those in the old administration would not know how to act or with what clear powers their responsibilities, and these being appointed by John F. Kennedy to positions in the new administration would have the same difficulty making any plans. Then, too, so basically, I just want to go. I'm not going to read this whole thing. Basically, Nixon, they're just painting Nixon, and because he had complaints about voter fraud, but he didn't necessarily do anything about it because he was worried that, and here, as he wrote in his book, he was worried that a peaceful transfer of power would not be completed. So they're giving this as, see, he was a Republican and he thought there was fraud too, but he did what was best for the country. So that's their logic there. So we're going to go right over to the Sunday morning propaganda where Gayle King fawns over President Obama. So let's listen in.
Uh-oh, don't lose your mask now. We all good? We got speed?
Feeling that I had entered, not an office, but a sanctum of democracy.
I think it was President Lincoln who said, if you weren't religious before you got in office, you sure are on your knees praying once you're in office.
Now, I just want to go, he's on a book tour, so he was on several news shows today, and it's funny how he releases his book right after the election. It's just, again, trying to solidify the veneer of the Democrats, which is slowly peeling away.
We're going to make you a one-term president. Mitch McConnell said that out loud.
People were losing their jobs, they were losing their homes, and the economy was collapsing. At the time, I thought, all right, well, obviously Republicans aren't going to agree with me on everything, but on this, all the economists agreed this is what we need. They'll give some cooperation on this, and we didn't get any.
The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act eventually did pass, with just 3 Republican senators voting yes. As the president then set out to overhaul the health care system, opposition to his agenda only increased. When he addressed Congress in September of his first year in office, the hostility was overt and it was startling.
You're laying out the Affordable Care Act, joint session of Congress, and in the middle of your speech, Congressman Joe Wilson, South Carolina, yells in the middle of that, "You lie." I heard a audible gasp.
The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally. It's not true.
And as we know that the Democrats do want to supply free health care through Obamacare to illegal immigrants. That's what they're proposing now. So was it a lie?
What did you think in that moment, and what did you want to do, and what did you do?
And my initial instinct is, let me walk down and smack this guy on the head. What is he thinking?
It's not true.
And instead I just said, that's not true, and I just move on. Although, as I point out in the book, he saw a huge spike in campaign contributions from Republicans across the country who thought he had done something heroic. Oh, that boy was so stupid.
Now Barack Obama can look back on his successes and failures. He had come into office facing high expectations, both as the first black president and at the age of 47, one of the youngest.
A lot of folks, in the same way that they expected, now we're in a post-racial America because we elected a black president. I think a lot of people expected, well, we got this young progressive president, and now suddenly we're going to eliminate inequality, and we're immediately going to have universal health care, and we're going to have climate change legislation, immigration reform, and criminal justice reform, and all the things that I wanted to get done. But what I understood very early on is the federal government, headed by the president, is an ocean liner.
President Obama's successor was Donald Trump. Some have seen Mr. Trump's victory, in part, as a backlash to the Obama presidency.
Donald Trump often raises eyebrows when he says he's done more for black America and people of color.
Yes.
I have done more for the African American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln.
What do you think when you hear that? Do you take that as an insult to you?
No, I think it's fair to say that there are many things he says that I do not take, although I think they can often be destructive and harmful.
President Barack Hussein Obama comes out.
Barack Obama emerged front and center in the last month of his former Vice President Joe Biden's presidential campaign.
Trump cares about feeding his ego. Joe cares about keeping you safe and your family safe.
They called it Barack Obama Unleashed.
The truth is, everything I said, I was just stating facts.
You got a president right now, he wants full credit for the economy that he inherited. He wants zero blame. Pandemic he ignored.
I was not the person who, in a White House briefing room, said, how is bleach the way to solve COVID? It is not my preference to be out there. I think we were in a circumstance in this election in which certain norms, certain institutional values that are so extraordinarily important had been breached.
This election is over.
President Trump continues without evidence to challenge the election's outcome.
They're trying to steal an election.
And many of Mr. Trump's supporters continue to stand behind him.
72 million people voted for Donald Trump.
Well, what it says is that we are still deeply divided. The power of that alternative worldview that's presented in the media that those voters consume, it carries a lot of weight. It's very hard for our democracy to function if we are operating on just completely different sets of facts.
But it's clear as we sit here today, we're not going to have a peaceful transition. We're not going to have a peaceful transition.
If you succeed, then the country succeeds.
I wish that you succeed because we want the country to succeed.
Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Kamala Harris will be the next vice president. There's no legal basis.
He's getting support from members of the Republican Party.
They obviously didn't think there was any fraud going on because they didn't say anything about it for the first 2 days.
But if I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. And I'll tell you what. Number two, they cheat. They cheat. Hey, they found ballots in a waste paper basket 3 days ago, and they all had the name military ballots. They were military. They all had the name Trump on them.
We're not above the rules. We're not above the law. That's the essence of our democracy. I'm not planning to suddenly work on the White House staff or something. And suddenly we stop, and I'm like, what's going on?
All right, that's it for us tonight. We'll see you next Sunday. Check us out, Twitter, Facebook. Rudy's Revelation.